Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael McQuarrie. I'm the director of the Center for Work and Democracy here at Arizona State University. It is my great pleasure today to introduce you to Richard McGahey. Rick is an economist and is a senior fellow at the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy and the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. He's also a visiting scholar here at the Center for Work and Democracy in Tempe. He's an expert on policy, economics, urban politics, and a number of other subjects. He has a long experience as a policy expert working at both the national and the local level. And he's the author of this recent book, Unequal Cities, which I hope that you will buy and read. He brings an element of wisdom to all of these subjects that few of us could actually muster. And before I bring Rick up here, I also want to note that this is the first of a number of events we'll be having on campus this semester. If you go to our website, you'll find that Cedric de Leon will be coming here to talk about his new book, Freedom Train, on race and unionism. Anand Gopal, whose new book, Love and Rage in Difficult Times? Days of Love and Rage. Which is on efforts to build municipal democracy in the middle of the Syrian civil war. These events will be coming up soon, and we hope that you'll be able to spend time with us when those excellent scholars are in town. But before I go on too long about the various other things we're doing, I do want to turn it over to the main reason we're here, and please join me in welcoming Rick McGahey.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks to the center, and particularly to Michael, Maria Esch, and Kayla Lee for the great work in setting this up. It's great to have you out here. We're going to talk about Mayor Mamdani and leave a lot of time for questions and discussion, so I'm pleased that you're all here. Let's get right to it. As New York's new mayor, we've been wrestling with technology. I hope it works, but I want to start off with something. Mamdani came really out of nowhere in New York. He was a state assemblyman, 2% when he announced in the polls. People thought it was a very fringe thing, and really quite a brilliant campaign, not just on content, but on communications. So this is one of my favorite clips. I hope we can play it. Who knows what the polar bear plunge is? You probably don't have it in Arizona. On January 1st, there every year, in the middle of winter, people go in their skivvies to Coney Island, and they dive into the water and swim around, and that's the polar bear plunge. The air and water temperature are pretty cold. I think it was about 40 degrees this year. And Mamdani has an idea of a rent freeze. We'll talk more about that later, how you might actually do it. But he wanted to get that out for freezing your rent. So you could stand up there and make a speech. And, well, this is now pretty self-explanatory if we can get it to run. So here is Mayor Mamdani at the then candidate Mamdani at the polar bear plunge.
All right, as the next mayor of New York City, let's plunge into the details. More than 2 million New Yorkers live in rent-stabilized units, and their rents are set by the Rent Guidelines Board. The board is made up of 9 members, and the mayor appoints each one. Doing this, Eric Adams' board has raised the rent every year he's been in office. Makes sense for a guy who said, I am real estate. Currently, 8 of Adams' 9 appointees' terms are up and could be replaced tomorrow. And that's exactly what I would do. Rent freezes have happened before. De Blasio's board did it 3 times. I would do the same every year, only appointing those who understand that landlords are doing just fine. Last March, the board found that landlord incomes rose by nearly twice the increase of their expenses. The median income for a rent-stabilized household is $60,000 a year. Any rent hike could push them out of this city. For those landlords who need a little extra help, there's a city fund they can apply to. So here's to a new year, a new mayor, and the same rent.
As a longtime observer of political stuff, that is brilliant in a number of ways. Get your attention, right? You're never going to forget about freeze. But the amount of content, policy content in that advertising, what's the Rent Guidelines Board? How many members are there? How do they get appointment? What are their powers? Try and make an ad out of that and communicate with anybody. But it's fantastic. The guy, he didn't make a false step through it. But just importantly, the communication he was quite polarizing, particularly around issues of Palestine, were a big divider in it, and people said they would never vote for him. He was opposed by Andrew Cuomo, a former governor, who a number of people also said they would never vote for, and it turned out more people wouldn't vote for Andrew Cuomo, but it was quite a polarized election. He also mobilized a huge number of volunteers, over 50,000 volunteers, over 1 million door knocks, calls, appearances in subways. We often think those things don't work. Hugely energetic and a huge turnout. Almost 2.2 million votes were cast in the election. That's the highest since 1969. It was 84% more votes than were cast the previous election for Mayor Adams. Mamdani won with 51% of the vote. Young voters were 75% of Mamdani. There was a surge in new voter registrants. We often have talked about this hope that there are registrants out there you can get, and that would be the difference in an election. It clearly was in this one. He also eventually won over black voters. He didn't win black voters in the primary. They stayed with Cuomo, but they shifted over in the general. And I think made not a step wrong during the campaign. And he was advantaged by Cuomo because Cuomo was poison to a lot of people, particularly for his sexual harassment activities. He was driven out of office for those, never convicted on them, but clearly guilty or responsible. But he had a lot of other institutional support. We'll talk about that a little later. And, oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong spot. It's fun to watch every time, but we saw that. So here's the talk today. We're going to talk about what the mayor can and can't do. There are 3 buckets I want us to keep our eye on. The budget, politics, by which politics I mean both electoral politics and interest groups, and the institutional arrangements by which you get things done politically. And then administrative, running the government, running the day-to-day stuff. And those 3 things are all things that any mayor, and certainly this one's going to have to do to be successful, and they all have real challenges to them. There's a tension with a lot of the policies he's advocated and his ability to achieve those, certainly in the short run. And I want to take, rather than trying to cover the whole span of his policy ideas, he's got a lot of them, I want to dig down deep into housing, one of the key affordability issues. It's a way both to talk about that policy, but also to illustrate these broader 3-pronged challenges that he's facing. And then we'll have a discussion. I should say he's got a lot of attention. New York's a big famous place. He's a democratic socialist. We haven't seen that for a while, but we're not without a history of progressive mayors in the United States. The upper corner is Milwaukee's famous to some of us sewer socialists. Milwaukee had elected socialist mayors for quite some time in their period. The first one, I believe it was Seidel, ran with Debs on the presidential ticket, on the socialist presidential ticket. But they all the way up through 1960, people who said they were socialists, but they really concentrated on government delivery. But there have been other progressive mayors, not self-declared socialists. LaGuardia in New York, Coleman Young in Detroit, one of my favorites, gets a bad press. Detroit is a very racially polarized place, and he wasn't able to solve that. But Young was a former UAW organizer, probably a Communist Party member, never declared it, was hauled in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee and told them off, yelled at them, stood up, and made him very popular in Detroit for doing that. And Harold Washington in Chicago. And currently we have at least three other presidents. Michelle Wu in Boston in the center there, Brandon Johnson in Chicago, facing a lot of troubles, and the brand new mayor, Katie Wilson in Seattle, who came really kind of out of nowhere, won a squeaker of a vote, and is now the mayor of Seattle. So progressive mayors, we've had them before, and we'll have them since. So Mamdani is, and of course that, what's his name, that guy from Burlington, Vermont. I mean, we don't know whatever happened to him, but he was a progressive mayor in Vermont. I love this phrase. I use it all the time. I work for Mario Cuomo, not for Andrew Cuomo. You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And if you need one line that at least characterizes my talk today, it's that you campaign, you get a message across, and then you got to actually do stuff. And that's very difficult. I mentioned the 3 challenges, so I won't read them off, but New York City has a massive budget and big financial constraints. It's a complicated set of institutional and political ally, political forces relationships in New York. This is true in any city. I'm just going to illustrate. New York's bigger, so sometimes it seems more overwhelming. But these factors actually play through most places you do politics. And in administrative, it's a big, big operation. Things can go wrong all the time that you aren't paying attention to and haven't got time to pay attention to, and you've got to work on those. So we're going to talk through each of those three buckets. And we will start with the budget, constraint number one. Those are two pretty complicated bar charts. I assume we can make the slides available to people for them at a later date. But on my side is the adopted budget for fiscal 2025. Where does the money get spent? Education and social services, other agencies, that's everything from the police to garbage to everything other than education and social services. So you see right away, education and social services are the dominant piece of the budget. And then fringe benefits and pensions, very expensive in New York. New York has over 300,000 direct employees, all unionized, except for a few managers. Debt service, little red bar, not that big, but important. So that's, and then a very small brown bar of reserve. And then here's where's it come from. It comes from tax revenues. I won't break those down. Most of that's property tax, actually. It's the biggest single source of New York City revenue is property taxes. New York City also has a pretty high income tax. Sales tax, and there's a lot of revenues that go into that. But property taxes are the main piece there. State grants, some of those are directly from the state budget, and some of those are passed through from the federal government. And the red bar is direct grants from the Fed. So the green and the red matter a lot for him now facing Donald Trump, because Trump is cutting major sources of money that would both come directly to the city and flow through the state to city allocations. So that's the challenge. The challenge has been made much worse, or facing him now. The new comptroller, a Democrat, kind of a mainstream Democrat, estimates that there's a $2 billion shortfall this year for the adopted budget already that they're short, and a $12 billion budget shortfall for the coming year, which starts in June. So he's already facing a $10 to $12 billion declared budget gap. The Trump cuts are estimated, it could be up to 10 point. The city gets in that direct grants box about $10 billion. Those are being cut pretty radically, a lot of them for affordable housing, environmental, other sorts of programs being fought out in courts, but so far they haven't come through. And then the pass-through money, particularly money like SNAP and Medicaid cuts, a lot of which goes through from the state to the city. So big budget challenges. Big price tags for what he wants to do. Universal child care, which has really emerged now. It wasn't so much a feature of his campaign, but it has really emerged near the end of the campaign on affordability issues and has caught the attention of the state government. $6 billion annually cost. There's some feeling you could get some of that back by freeing up women to go into the workforce and generate tax revenues and more economic activity, but it's still expensive. Free bus service. Another complication, Mamdani doesn't actually control the buses. They're controlled by the Metropolitan Transit Authority, a state agency, but it's about a $600 million hit on a fare box that's pretty low. Housing costs really vary all over the place. Could be $100 billion over 10 years or higher. And we'll talk about the constraints on that. Grocery stores, that's kind of receded in what he's done, an expensive and complicated administratively thing to do. And then these aren't talked about much, but there are major labor contracts this year. Police contract, it actually hasn't expired, that's wrong. It expires in June. And municipal workers, DC 37, by far the biggest union in the city, 150,000 members, that expires this year. So that's, he's looking at some pretty complicated stuff. Now, Hochul, the governor, is running for re-election, and she has endorsed the universal child care and said the state will pay for the first 2 years of it, which is fantastic, because she sees advantage for herself on that issue as well. So is going to get some funding support for the universal child care that wasn't initially expected, and that's good. They're still extremely complicated administratively to get it done. However, he had also called for tax increases, both raising the corporate tax rate just to be the same rate as New Jersey across the river. It wasn't some huge balloon, but it would equalize the rate with New Jersey's corporate rate and also a higher tax on New York millionaires. Hochul's rejected both of those. The New York governor, Democrat, does not want to run on tax increases this year. There might be a chance at them, I would think, next year, assuming she gets reelected. I mentioned the federal cuts. Then there could be, one of the things that's holding the revenues up is Wall Street. And one of the paradoxes for any progressive mayor in New York City is that the city gets huge amounts of revenue from the financial services industry and from wealthy people on Wall Street. There's a lot of the income tax, it keeps some of the property tax and other work up, and it's a bit of a devil's bargain because when the financial service industry does well, more money comes into the city treasury, allowing it to spend. My own view is that financialization in general was quite bad for the U.S. economy, turning finance into a key sector, but regionally, New York in the short term benefited because of the concentration of financial services. It benefited in revenue terms. It increased inequality because finance is generally a much more unequal industry. And the New York budget has been rising faster than inflation and population growth for quite some time, pre-de Blasio even. It's been going up and up and up. So he's on a trend with that. Some of that was a bump from the pandemic, but not all of it. There are also just steady increases in costs on the budget possibilities. So that's a big budget, big challenges, new expensive stuff, a lot of constraints. Politics, and by politics I mean both electoral and the kind of politics we think of with that, but also the institutional arrangements of New York City and what it can do. New York State has a lot of control over what the city can do. Taxes, Mamdani can't raise the taxes he wants to raise. They have to be raised by the state legislature and approved by the governor. To get the bus fares thing, it has to go through a state agency, the MTA. If he wants to borrow more money to build affordable housing, state has to approve that budget, the caps on the budget and how much he can borrow or authorize it. There are two reasons for that. One is actually, and as my book, please go buy it, will tell you, cities are creatures of states in the United States. It's not particular to it. There's a doctrine from the 19th century that says that cities, that was finally fought out and decided in favor of states, saying that if states could create cities or destroy them by charters, then they can regulate them. So there's very little, so it varies from state to state how much home rule there is, but the dominant form is a city that is controlled by the state. In addition, New York, of course, has the legacy of the massive fiscal crisis in the 1970s, where New York was a day away from going bankrupt. Literally, the bankruptcy document was on the mayor's desk on a Thursday night, ready to sign it, saying they couldn't pay their bills. Union pension funds rescued that in the short term, particularly the teachers' unions, and bailed that out, thinking that they would then have a cooperative government in New York, and they didn't get it. They got instead austerity and real federal crackdown on money. But that built in extra fiscal controls and oversight and bond market controls that are still in place and the state can still exercise. I mentioned the federal cuts. I won't do those again. So those are these institutional arrangements. And then New York, it's just like any political place, it's really complicated, right? There's lots of conflict about people. New York has a particular history. I learned from political science John Mullen, a great friend of mine, that it's partly tied to New York's immigrant heritage. There are pockets of somewhat ethnically decided neighborhoods in a very big place. Those pockets often then have nonprofit organizations that do sometimes meritorious things, sometimes not, with public revenue. They're job providers and they generate political support for the people in that. And then a strong set of interest groups across the board. We've heard a lot about progressive groups in the Mamdani campaign, but there are conservative ones as well. Again, the Palestine issue is extremely volatile in New York's Jewish community, which is a big chunk of views. I think New York is the largest Jewish city in the world, or second maybe to one of the ones in Israel. But Mamdani did quite well on that. He got a lot of the Jewish vote because they also were critics of Israel on the Palestine issue. So it turned out not to be the third rail that everybody had thought it would be, at least so far. But this complexity of interest groups, all of whom have both a political and a material stake in what they're doing, just makes getting anything done complicated. He's building labor relationships. Mamdani was not a strong labor, he's a young guy, so he doesn't have a lot of stuff. He had some labor support in his elections, but it's not strong. The strongest union person in this election there is Andrew Cuomo up in the corner. Most unions endorsed Andrew. Mamdani only had a few. The CUNY public service employees, the professors voted for him, and my union, Region 9A of the UAW, which is dominated in our region by professors and part-time faculty members, voted for him. But all of the industrial unions, the public union in the city, DC 37, has been at war with Cuomo ever since some pension reforms he made as governor. So they didn't endorse him, and they were kind of lukewarm on Mamdani. But once he won the primary, you can see in that second lot, all the union signs came over to him. The unions really shifted dramatically. They didn't stay with Cuomo and came over and supported him. And he has continued to push this out. You see there he is with Bernie Sanders. New York nurses are on strike, not at city-owned hospitals, but they're out in the 3 major hospital systems. And he showed up with Bernie on the picket line with the nurses just the other day. Again, in his trademark suit. I guess the look now is just the black suit. It was 31 degrees that day and cold. See, Bernie's got his coat on, but Mamdani is going to get used to seeing him that way. And he's made great appointments who have strong labor ties. And I want to call out 3 of them. The bald person down there sitting with Bill de Blasio is Dean Fullahan, first deputy mayor, the most important operational job in the city. Fullahan is a long veteran of New York City government, was de Blasio's head of budget, and then his first deputy mayor. A telling point about Fullahan and why it matters for this slide is that when Michael Bloomberg left office, he left every labor contract in New York City open. Bloomberg hated unions. He wouldn't negotiate with them, and it was well over, there are 152 bargaining units in the city. Every one of them was open. And within a year and a half, de Blasio, with Fullahan as the workhorse, settled all those contracts. People remember de Blasio as they should for universal pre-K and that, but this settling of the labor disputes at that scale and with a lot of other things to do was a real, in my view, super accomplishment that even de Blasio doesn't get enough credit for, but Dean was the guy that did that. Julie Su, he's made Mamdani has a new office called Deputy Mayor for Economic Justice, not quite clear what it will do. But Julie Su, as you can read the slide, she was Biden's acting Secretary of Labor, very focused on, got her started as someone who's fighting sweatshops and wage theft, very focused on low-wage workers in particular. So I would expect a very aggressive effort on wage theft, regulation of labor standards coming from her. And then his Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, Jamil Edwards, was Associate Director of DC 37, the biggest municipal union in the city and the one that's the most important to him. Police get a lot of attention, but to make the place run, DC 37 is it. And she now is a very prominent and important position for him. So what this says to me is for a guy without a lot of deep labor ties, he's getting it so far, right? He knows that that's an important constituency for him that he doesn't have long relationships with, and he's working that. I mentioned the contracts that are coming up. I won't belabor those. And there are tons of other important labor issues in New York for the existing workforce. The dominant one is that New York outsources a lot of its social services. Remember that bar back on the graph, all that money that gets spent? New York, like a lot of cities, delivers a lot of its social services, childcare, some other things, through nonprofit organizations, not through city employees. The Center on Institute Race, Power, and Political Economy, where I work in New York, we did a study comparing the wage levels of unionized workers for the same work that's done by people in the nonprofit sector, and not surprisingly, the wages and benefits for the nonprofits are much worse. Getting parity would cost you a lot, but it ends up creating a double wage system that is particularly disadvantaging because a lot of it's in-home health care and child care, particularly disadvantaging to women and non-white workers, that gap. And so that'll be coming up again. So that's the budget constraints, fast shot through political constraints, and then administrative constraints. Anyone here worked in government before? But you've worked in big, kind of complex, messy organizations, right? And you all know bureaucracies, and you all know difficulties in getting things done. And the line is an old line. I was going to say, quote somebody, but it's attributed to like 10 different people on the internet. So I'll just say, people are policy. You can have policy ideas up here. You've got to deliver it through people. I think, again, Mamdani is doing, and this is a longish statement from him, but I think it's worth reading because he's thoughtful about this. I'm passionate about public goods. We on the left have to be equally passionate about public excellence. Any example of public inefficiency is an opportunity for the argument to be made against the very existence of the public sector. So I think it's a good framing. We want to do this stuff well, but one of the reasons we need to do it well is to legitimate the idea, is both to deliver the services, but also legitimate the idea that the public sector can do stuff effectively. So again, that's he said some great stuff that I am very hopeful he'll be able to carry through. His top appointments matter. They've been good, but most of it, as in any organization, 300,000 some employees, 90 agencies, bureaus, boards. Some of those are trivial, but some are big, like the Department of Education or the police. All the action takes place way down low in the levels of day-to-day decisions made by civil servants at different levels. And so how you drive both this desire for excellence generally and the specific policies he wants to do through that system is, for those of you studying public administration or public policy, or business or management or anything, that's that business. I don't have any simple bromides on it. But how do you help keep managers and workers? How do you get them to believe? They get used in government. I've managed in government before, and they are used to people coming in and saying stuff. Oh, we're going to change everything around. It's going to be great, and they're very cynical about it. So how can you get that to be real and make it work? Because that's what it's going to take to really deliver a lot of the outcomes that he wants to deliver, even if he can get the money he wants. And then the city has complicated webs of regulations and procedures. They grew up for a lot of ways. This is probably something we'll want to talk about. I'm a bit of an abundance person, for those of you who know that lingo, not the way it's been presented, but in the sense that we can, mostly inadvertently, by creating webs of regulations in different spheres, we might have created in some sectors, made it too difficult to get things done. And we'll talk about that in housing. But anyway, just think about if you were the mayor of New York City or even one of these agency heads, what you'd be facing trying to get stuff done. And most of that budget we saw before is already committed. 97, 98% of it's going to be spent on the things it's already being spent on, because those are important functions to get things done. And so if all you think about is the new money, you also aren't going to get scale in outcomes, because you've got to try and start to think about ways to do differently with the vast amount of money you've already got. So let's take a case in point, the housing crisis. On everyone's mind, a core to his affordability idea, wants to build 200,000. Sometimes he says 200,000 affordable, sometimes he says 200,000. But here in New York's a little different. 70% of households rent. So renters, tenants, landlords, big deal. Homeowners have power, particularly in some parts of the city, but it is a rental city. And you'll see in the market rate rentals are just about 50% of the total, and then rent stabilized, call it rent control. It's not quite the stabilization means that you raise the rent percentage every year for the apartments that are covered. That's what that board does that he was talking about every year. They go through a process every year to say what the rent increases should be. And then public housing, which we haven't talked about, another 7% of units not in the rent stabilized system. And just, I'm a left YIMBY, I don't know if you are, I'm a housing supply, I want more housing supply. So this graph is quite telling, like New York has a 1.4% vacancy rate now in apartments, 1.4%. For apartments under $2,100, I think it's under 1% vacancy rate. So basically there's no apartments that you can rent. And it's the enormous price pressure that it puts on it. And there wasn't much built. The gray line is the payroll employment for New York City, going back to all the way back in 1980, but the line starts more continuously about 2010. And then the number of housing units. And you can just see the gap spreading. So we don't have, however one wants to think about closing that number of housing unit gap, and I know there are other ideas about this, particularly more government investment and more public and social housing. I don't think, it's pretty clear to me at least, that there's a supply gap right now versus what the city's economy is doing. Also is the affordability. So that blue line is median gross rent, and the orange line is median household renter income. All right, so it's spread. It closed a little bit here. That's some temporary endemic of pandemic money. You'd see that at the same time with the employment drop. There was a pandemic twist in this, but what you want to do is look at the trend of the line, and there's a gap there that stays there pretty well. So New York's got a big housing problem, and central to his both claims of affordability and doing something about it are trying to address that. I went through a lot of these. We can come back to these in I'm just giving you my declarations. Happy to talk about them more. I'm not going to dive into them now. There are a number of things I think that people, particularly on the left, believe are causing the high real estate prices that I don't think are the main causes of it. But I don't want to make that central to what I'm saying right now. Happy to talk about it in Q&A. New York has specific problems. Again, all cities are particular, so they have stuff. In 1961, they changed zoning and just downsized how much stuff you could build. FAR is floor area ratios. That's how many floors, how much stuff you can put on a piece of land. And it was radically downsized in 1961. And parking requirements were added. Parking requirements for if you're a YIMBY are the bane of your existence, that everything you build has to have places for cars, and so that just takes up land space and sprawl. Not recognizing that Michael Bloomberg and others downzone. Now, what is downzone? Upzoning is when you let more housing get built on a particular piece of land. Downzoning is when you do the reverse. You take it out. And Bloomberg, for all the attention about the big building on the west side of Manhattan and a few other places, downzoned a lot of New York City. A lot of neighborhoods in the outer boroughs, which are dominated by single-family homeowners, were downzoned, even near transit hubs. That you could build less housing on them than you could before. And then city council, this back in politics, something called member deference. Again, something that's not unique to New York, that if I'm the city council representative for a particular district, I have veto power effectively over whether something gets built in my neighborhood or not. And that is exercised quite strongly in many cities, and certainly was in New York. That has been addressed by some charter revisions, but those haven't gone into place yet. So that's the inadequate level of thinking. Well, let me say one more thing about this, that all the mayoral candidates in the Democratic primary had some kind of left YIMBY form. There was no one who ran on a no more housing construction, it's too big. Everybody said we got to build a lot more units, we got to rezone, because in this analysis, zoning is the key. You've got to free up more land to allow denser, which in cities means multifamily using housing on top of it. There are now, in this last election when Mamdani got elected, there were also amendments to the city's charter, the governing document of the city. It's kind of like a constitution, that now require changes that have limited council member deference over housing projects at least. So we'll see how those play through. So the second line is one I kind of like. It was a little snarky one from a guy named Josh Barrow. I modified it here slightly. But Mamdani is now both pro-development and construction and pro-rent regulation and freezing rents. Right? So it's, I adapted Barrow says capitalism for developers, socialism for landlords. That's both extreme in both cases. But that seems to be the duality that he's pushing forward. There's still some ambiguity in how much market rate development he wants. Although in an interview with the New York Times in the summer, they asked, what have you changed your mind about? And he said, I've changed my mind about the private market role in housing development. I used to be opposed to it. Now I realize it plays an important part. That's all he said. He didn't say how big a part. Is it only you get it if you also build affordable at the same time? There's all sorts of ways you could implement that. But he was signaling that he doesn't think, at least for New York in the short run, it can be done solely by the public sector. But and simultaneously a very strong increase attention on tenant protections and on landlord regulation. I mentioned this before. That's him as an assemblyman fighting against a $2 billion housing development in Queens because he said it didn't have enough affordable housing. He said that project had 25% affordability. So Mamdani as an assemblyman opposed developments with 25% affordability targets. But as I say, he now said he's changed his mind on the role of the private market. His executive orders on the first day, several pro-housing orders, mostly to build affordable housing, but still get rid of these there's a lot of bureaucratic things in the way of it. We got to streamline it. I want this done. Faster construction, including limiting some environmental reviews, which so far he hasn't taken any hit for. We'll see if he does. He's agreed with the governor of New York that the New York's version of statewide environmental reviews, not as onerous as California's, but not great, needs to be cut back, at least in the housing sphere. And so he may serve a useful function for the governor to have somebody this identified as left saying we have to streamline environmental regulation around housing. His new deputy mayor for housing and planning was in the city for, so under Mayor Eric Adams, who was largely a disaster, one of the things that did work was the so-called City of Yes, which freed up a lot of zoning activity, more transit-oriented development, that is, you can have denser housing next to a subway stop or a bus stop, and a few other things that would streamline and make the proposals faster. Big fight with the city council, but passed. Still hasn't been implemented, so in the administrative bucket, those zoning changes are written out now, but they have not been activated or put into place, and no one's really tried to build anything under them yet, which will bring more litigation. But on regulation, stronger renter protection. Now, New York had some prior steps in this. 2019 law change in the rent guidelines, rent stabilization. It limited the rent increases on that you could do on the stabilized apartment, remember, which are about 45% of the total units in the city. It ended vacancy decontrol, a very big thing. It used to be when a tenant left, the landlord could bring the rate up to a market rate or some much higher thing. There's no vacancy. That has been cut way back in New York in a way that there's a lot of complaints about now, which we'll come to. There's right to counsel, not really fully provided. The state passed a good cause eviction law in 2024. It's not really good cause in the classic sense for those of you that know that, but it really strengthens tenants' hands if a landlord is disputing with them. And Mamdani, and again, another of his executive orders, day one, in addition to streamlining housing construction, was strengthening. There's an existing thing called the Mayor's Office to Protect Tenements. It's been really not very effective or very used much. He's appointed somebody named C. Weaver, a very left pro-tenant activist from New York. She's being attacked by the conservative press because they've dug out some tweets from her from about 5 or 6 years ago about housing as white supremacy and a few other things. But she is now his, she also is an extremely effective tenant organizer and someone who actually gets legislation passed. So, and he's put her in charge of this office for tenants. Having hearings on rental ripoffs, he tried to intervene. There's a bankruptcy. Pinnacle is a big owner of rent-stabilized units, went bankrupt, thousands of violations on its record, eventually went bankrupt and was the bankruptcy sale of the units to another big real estate corporation was just about to take place. Mamdani tried to intervene legally, couldn't do it. The judge rejected that. He's going to keep at it. But again, partly substantive and partly just trying to message people that he's really taking steps on this. And he's called for the rent freeze. He doesn't control the rent guidelines board right now. Adams made appointments, and the timing of how people get on and off that. If people really want to know the painful details about the board, we can do it. But he right now, his members don't control the board, and they have a vote coming up in June. So how he affects that for the rent freeze will be interesting to see. So that's a very fast flyer over the housing stuff. One of the real challenges in getting rents down or frozen is that new construction, even at scale, takes time. And it'll take time to, often critics of particular projects will say, well, that project won't bring rents down. And that's true. No single building is going to lower rents in a municipality. You need scale. And it will take time for that to affect rent levels. There are legal caps on the amount the city can borrow. There's an estimated $100 billion gap in its current bonding ability to hit the targets that he wants to borrow. The state would have to raise those. That would also set off ripples in the bond market because it's not just the legal requirements about city and state borrowing, it's how will the private bond market see large increases in borrowing coming from a city that has those revenue constraints. And then Trump is flat-out attacks on affordable housing, withdrawing vouchers and other issues. Another tension is just in the real estate business, they call this penciling out. Like, can I make that building work or not? And often the trade-off in negotiation for affordable units is how many more for-profit units can I build? You let me build more units, I'll put more affordability, or I'll pay a higher fee, or some other function. And a lot of the affordable housing day-to-day administrative stuff is trying to figure out how to do that on a project. How much do you give the developers? on the for-profit side versus what do you get back on the affordability side. And it's very hard, I think, to make general rules about that. But the developers want them, and they say we won't build without that. We won't build affordable units without that. And that's quite controversial, right? To say we want to build a bigger, taller office building or bigger apartment building in a neighborhood that doesn't have them, because you're going to get more affordable units, can create quite a complicated story. New York still has a lot of single-family homeowners, private homeowners, who tend to be conservative, outer boroughs and Staten Island in particular. So it's not just the community left activists that are worried about this. A lot of the resistance to more dense housing comes from Republican-affiliated, conservative, whiter homeowners in New York City. Then that's a big, it's a force that didn't win the election, but it's a non-negligible force in city. Back to limiting rent increases. This is the problem with the 2019 law, some people say. It means that the small landlords can't cover the repair costs. So my friend Mark Willis at New York University really studies this, and he says the 2019 law put major downward pressure on landlords, that you couldn't do vacancy decontrol. You were another way that landlords could raise rent and say, oh, I'm making capital improvements and get money for that. And some of that was fake. You know, they would pretend to be making the improvements, claim them, and then try and raise the rent. But some of it was real. Mark's estimates are that the rents on a lot of these stabilized buildings are not sufficient to cover operating costs and inflation for hundreds of thousands of stabilized units in New York. So the current rent level, if you freeze it, doesn't, by his estimates, which I think are pretty good, will not give you enough money to keep up the repairs and maintenance on these little apartments. I'm not taking a position on the freeze on that. I'm just saying that's one of the real fights. Mamdani in the ad made a reference. He said, oh, for small landlords, there's a program that we could do some help with. Maybe, but then thinking about setting up a small landlord, back to the administrative problem, right? Set up a program that's going to have radical rules, regulations, appeals, get data in. I'm not trying to solve that problem here, but I want to point out that it's a real tension. On the other hand, as he said in the ad, and it's true, under de Blasio, the rent froze rents 3 times. It's not like it's never been done before. Rent has been frozen in New York. And under de Blasio, you can read the numbers, 5.25, while overall inflation went up 20. Adams, in his 4 years, pushed rents up much higher than de Blasio, 9%, but inflation still outran that. Again, he doesn't control it. Then we didn't talk about NYCHA. I'll just mention it. New York City Housing Authority, over 175,000 units, $37 billion in immediate repair needs, that it's not clear how they finance those, and $78 billion over 20. And those are not in the rent-regulated system, but they are key to affordable housing in New York altogether. Hope this isn't too gloomy. John Lindsay once said New York mayor is the second hardest job in America. It might be the easiest, it might be the hardest one now, given the way that Trump is the president. To some extent, these challenges are what's faced by all mayors. You've got more needs than you've got revenues and constraints. You've got politics that pull you in different ways. You've got administrative issues. He's got, I think, in this year, it's always dangerous to forecast, but 3 big things to look at. These budget constraints. He has to put a preliminary budget in by mid-February and then coordinate that with the state budget. These big labor contracts. And then the guidelines board in June on rent increases. Those are all going to be 3 big markers on the affordability issues. And then these are just rhetorical questions. I've been saying them throughout. I won't repeat them, but just he's got these goals. They're fantastic goals, I think, and really has energized a lot of people. Another of the political challenges is how do you keep your political base energized when you start running into the realities of these governance issues. I wanted to work through the housing in some detail because I think it's the same kind of complexities in other issues. Public safety and policing, education, certainly New York City schools are more segregated now than they were 20, 30 years ago. Environment, transportation, you name the issue, it's got these kind of complications. So it may not have sounded like this from my tone, but I think he's off to a great start. I mean, I was a skeptic, and Teresa and I know this. We had lots of debates in our house about the guy. I guess he hadn't run anything. You know, he didn't have governing experience, and I didn't know how he was going to do this stuff. But at the same time, I've worked for good elected politicians, and they also are really good at messaging and communicating. And I knew he had that down. And so far, he's able to ally that to me, but both what he says, where he shows up, but also the quality of his appointments and the real hard work and intelligence and energy he's bringing to this. So I am very hopeful, even in the face of all this, all these challenges. And I'll stop there. I'm sure you guys have got a lot to say or questions, and we can go from there. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. We're just going to start the Q&A section. We are recording this as well, so please make sure to put the microphone in front of you as well. But we're going to raise our hands and just kind of start from there. Yes, it is correct. You're all good.
Yeah, just hold it. Mike's standing. I'm an old rock performer, so often when people don't get the mic close enough. So kiss the mic is what they say.
I think it's me. Hi, Rick.
Hi.
Thanks so much for that. Going back to your focus on housing and his focus, which I think is really important. Excuse me. I was a landlord in San Francisco, and anecdotally, I had a protected tenant who was in the building for 40 years. Paid $1,500 for a 2,200 square foot apartment. I have several friends in New York City who hung on to rent-controlled or rent-stabilized apartments forever, and then somehow were able to pass them on to their children. So I would kind of like to ask you if you, because I know you've studied a lot of other cities, is there a different model that works better? Because if you have a single person staying in a 3-bedroom apartment, that's not an efficient use of space. So I don't know if you can address that, but thank you.
Yeah, I want to take a step back from it there, because all administrative systems we can all find, and we all know in any bureaucratic administrative system, we can find a case and say, oh, look at that, he's parking his bike, they're parking in the handicap spot where they're not supposed to, or they're doing this. Then so that there are big administrative issues. So the structural question is that kind of built in some way, and could you change that? On housing, for me, some of it is actually, and this is actually a message to my progressive friends, get on board with supply. Get more supply. That will make it easier for people to do things. If you look at the great kind of paired example right now is Minneapolis and St. Paul. St. Paul put in a very aggressive rent control system and not building things. Minneapolis did away with a lot of zoning. Minneapolis has built a lot more housing, and rents are coming down in Minneapolis. That doesn't resolve the problem of the individual landlords who are stuck in the system. I generally would want to lean away from too much of regulation and then regulation of the regulation. But once you start regulating, if you're not going to regulate rents, then there's just a massive affordability problem. And even with rent stabilization, a lot of New York City households can't afford rents. If we had an infinite bucket of money, I would be more prone to give vouchers to poor families for it. But without supply, those vouchers are just going to go right to landlords, right? If they don't have, if the landlords still have a 1% vacancy rate, as they do in New York, and you increase the rental income for renters, you might as well just write the check directly to the landlord, right? It doesn't stay. So it's a supply thing. I don't, these are big messes. I don't know how much, those are really hard things to take on, and often politicians don't think there's a lot of reward for taking them on, that untangling stuff like that. And then it's really a question how much that's the supply constraint for me, I guess. As bad as that is, I do think this inability to cover your costs in New York is going to be a real constraint on supply and construction. And that could be, so that's a tension that isn't worked out. Just as the constraint you're describing, like why would someone want to be a landlord, right? Or build a new building if they're going to be stuck with that. And I think in the public sector, people have to be mindful of that you may be creating, you may be overbalancing it. But I don't have a glib or simple answer for those particular problems.
Hello. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for your talk. I thought it was very interesting. My name's Justine. I'm a member and organizer with United Campus Workers of Arizona, our wall-to-wall union here at ASU, U of A, NAU, and recently the Maricopa Colleges. If you have questions, please come talk to me. And now I have 2 questions for you. My first question is, I'm wondering what it was that led black voters and unions to side with Cuomo during the primary and then switch to Mamdani later. And then I'm also wondering, when you're talking about vacancy rates, is that taking into account like short-term rentals and how short-term rentals impact
Sure.
that issue within New York, but
Sure.
also we know it's an issue everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you.
Sure. So black voters and union voters, Cuomo, Teresa's heard this joke too many times that I once said, oh, if we only had a Democratic national figure who was a governor of a big state, who had supported marriage equality, who had raised the minimum wage, who fought with Republicans, who built infrastructure, who had great relationships with unions, wouldn't that be a great candidate? Oh, it's Andrew Cuomo. That's bad news, but the salient issues around sexual harassment and other stuff that really mattered to a lot of people might not have mattered. I'm not a political scientist, but might not have mattered as much to those voters. Union, at least at the institutional level, tend to be somewhat loyal, and aside from the fight he had with the public employees around pensions, which is a big and ongoing fight, he had a lot of union support. Unions are diverse memberships in New York, and also the black leadership. Cuomo also had good relationships with the black existing leadership, not with the younger people. There was a pretty big age break. So in the primary, it's not surprising to me that they voted for him, because who's this guy Mamdani? He's a socialist, and from Queens, and Cuomo, I like him, and he's good. But the more interesting thing for me is once Mamdani won, that the unions and black voters shifted. They shifted off that to the Democrat. Some of that's maybe just loyalty. So I don't think it's surprising that support from them. He had a good track record with them, absent some really other awful issues, right? Sorry, tell me the second one again. Oh, about vacancies, right? No, New York bans Airbnbs now, actually, or really regulates the hell out of them. It's quite hard to go on Airbnb in New York City and see what you get. And also, they have, I think, they also have not had a lot of new hotel construction, probably because we went a little too far in limiting the ability to build new hotels, but that was tied to union representation issues. So that's not, it's not that people are holding, there's another one, you didn't say it, but there's another one people say, oh, landlords are holding units out of the market. I don't think those numbers hold up very well. Private equity is buying all the units. Small, I mean, I'm fine with banning them. It's politically popular, but that's not the central thing to me is the supply construction side, that we haven't built enough housing. The investor numbers about who owns houses, people say, well, this many investors own houses. If you look at those numbers, the investors, if you did a pie chart, I don't have it, the private equity slice is very small. Most investors who own rental housing are small mom and pop landlords who live in the same city, same metropolitan area, who often sometimes could be worse landlords, by the way. So it's not a scale thing. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm beating this drum here. Because I mean, my overall message for progressives is not wild building, not let just private for-profit developers do whatever they want, but absent, again, a big chunk of public money, we need more supply, and more supply is going to come from private. So is there a way? And this, I think, is consistent with certainly European democratic socialism, right? It's capitalism, and you're regulating it. You're not trying to end it. So that was more answer than you wanted there. Sure.
So, one thing on the housing thing, and then I have another question.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the experience in New York is weird because the demand has been high since the early 80s,
Yes.
right? Most of the free land that was made available in the 70s by thousands of buildings being burned down for insurance money, that land has all been put back.
For those of you who don't know,
to
Michael
use.
used to work directly in this space in New York, so he knows where he speaks.
And one of the challenges then was the issue of disinvestment by landlords,
Yes.
right? And so one of the Rent Regulation Board wasn't just about making it affordable. It was also about the issue of disinvestment in
Yes.
housing.
Yeah.
And some of the high-profile things that Mamdani has done has been going after not sort of mom and pop landlords
No,
who are
real
trying to make a
slumlord,
buck.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
slumlords. And whenever you have this thing where sort of a rent or a reimbursement is tied to a performance of a particular good,
Yeah.
you have this complicated problem because
Yep.
the incentives vary a lot in terms of the way they impact
Mm-hmm.
individual providers, and that works in healthcare with Medicaid reimbursement,
Yep.
just
Yep.
like it does
Yep.
in this case here. And I know you know way more about this than I do.
No.
But you know, one of the other things that Mamdani has said about this is that you know they are talking about doing an investment level requirement
Yes.
in exchange for rent increases
Mhm.
and things like that. So not just having it be, you can raise the rent this much and then you'll do whatever your personal inclinations are. It's if you want higher rent, then you need to invest,
Right.
Now, you've been pointing out all throughout this talk that there are administrative problems with everything from a handicap space to, you know, these much more complicated issues. But, you know, just based on, you know, the complexity of that issue,
Yeah.
we want things to be affordable, but we also don't want to encourage disinvestment. Like, you know, are there ways of solving that problem? Because it'll happen with all the new housing that comes online
Yes.
with your supply approach too, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
what we don't want
absolutely.
are parasitical behavior.
Right.
And we do want affordability, but we also want incentives to be appropriate.
Yeah.
And are there any new ways of thinking about this or anything like that to sort of solve that?
Yeah. Yeah, really well put, and exactly right, that if you, let's imagine two landlords and they get a rent increase and one says, oh great, now I can fix up my building and repair the boiler, and the other says, great, now I'm just going to pocket it and let the building run down and throw it into bankruptcy, right? And I don't, both of those things happen and sometimes happen a lot. I think their hope is because then again, okay, then who's going to police? Did the landlord? They actually have pretty good data on apartments and landlords for the Rent Guidelines Board. There's actually a pretty straightforward rental information system that comes, at least what they report on their taxes. That there are not armies of inspectors that can go out. My guess is from his appointment of Kay Weaver and other stuff that they may hope to mobilize tenant groups to do some of this monitoring. New York has very strong tenant community groups in this space. They, of course, could then have an incentive to overstate, but you don't have the ground troops to do the inspections that would be needed on the landlords. Something that says, send us your bills, you'll be backed up for 2 years bureaucratically. So I'm sure they're wrestling with this now, but I wouldn't be surprised to see some way to use the existing tenant advocacy organizations as ground troops and observers. You know, parallel, in a rough parallel, the way that in labor unions you use people on the shop floor to report stuff, even if they can't, as an information source. That would, if I were sitting in that chair and someone asked me to figure that out today, I think you'd have to try and think how to mobilize those advocates to do some of that. And you're right, the problem persists in all the things that he wants to get done. Is that, yeah. Hi.
Just to follow up on Michael's question, is there any outside-the-box thinking, outside capitalism thinking on kind of tackling the housing crisis, the affordability crisis? And the reason I ask is because we're still doing the demand and supply, and then the ecological question is being put at the back burner. So I'm wondering, given that he's been so creative is there an outside-the-box thinking, looking at other cities that might be trying out, or something out there that is not demand and supply? Because I think in that the environment loses.
Yes, certainly. So the question is there out-of-the-box thinking going beyond just standard capitalist supply and demand, where environment seems to drop out as something that people care about, and not just for the environment, but just to get it out of this supply-demand problem. I'm not aware in the U.S. because it would take a lot of money, and our cities are starved. I know Teresa tells me a lot about Vienna, so-called Red Vienna, where the government builds lots and lots of housing and then regulates it. But I assume that money comes from their federal government, not just the cities, or not just the Vienna city. One of our complications in the U.S., I alluded to governance, is also that our cities have to go through their states for financing, and our states don't like cities generally. They're hostile to cities and against them. But I'm guessing that would be one, or imagining that we would somehow get a more massive commitment to public housing construction, which contains its own challenges, right? If you look again at the NYC example I gave, there are $37 billion in the hole on basic repairs. I mean, real immediate crisis repairs for hundreds of 150,000 some units. So yeah, I think people are doing that. I guess I don't have them. I'm not aware in the I don't know other markets in New York, America that way. New York is also a little different that way. It's a big, dense market, 70% renters. Mostly people stay in it. You know, in cities and smaller municipalities, the boundaries are more fluid. You could imagine people moving out, but suburbs tend to be more hostile to multifamily affordable housing than this is. So I wish I knew more about it, but I don't. Do you know of examples? Or? Yeah.
I've been looking into people trying to, like, cooperatives or
Yeah.
Societies that are kind of
Yeah.
new ways of thinking. And given that he's charismatic and he's been able to
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
type ideas,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's any.
Yeah. Any co-op? Okay, so question, co-ops and other alternative structural forms. My own bias on those kind of things is that they don't scale easily, but they're certainly worth trying. We're in such crises on this that it's all worth it. They are going to pass in New York City a law that says when a building gets sold, that if there's a nonprofit tenants group, that they have some right to try and make a purchase of it. It'd still be hard for them to finance it, but I think that's a nod in that direction. There's a fascinating book by a historian guy, Daniel Wartell London, that I reviewed recently, where he takes on this model. He says in New York City, even the liberals and progressives, I guess he'd say it about it here, are still bound to the same economic model, an economic model that says land value increases are what drive your property taxes up, and so you have to keep that economy running in order to have the surplus that you use to finance social services. And he's a very visionary guy, so I could recommend his book to you for visions. And he says in New York history, there have always been people trying to do that, and they get squeezed out by this relentless market drive, that even the liberals and progressives are bound to this land value model, which I think Mamdani is probably tied to being in office. If he were, out of office, he could explore those things. And so I expect they will be open to trying stuff like that. It's not going to scale, I think, in time for his problem, would be my 2 cents. Ian.
Real quick, what was that author?
Daniel Wartell London. I'm blanking on the name of his book. I'll look it up before. It's a recent book. Daniel Wartell, W-R-T-E-L-London.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and I reviewed it in Forbes and was kind of skeptical again about these scaling issues, but it's a very visionary thing, and he really has done a lot. And the other great thing about it, what's really good about historians, is you see real people fighting about stuff. It's not just
absolutely.
Capitalism contending with blah blah blah. You see real people with complicated relationships and banging it out through the history. So
Yeah.
Minister of Prosperity. Thank you.
All
There's
right.
Craig. Thank you, Craig.
So my question is kind of about kind of how Mamdani is really different than many of the other progressive mayors of our time now. I think he is definitely much more of a echo of the sewer socialists like Hone and Seidel. The thing that I think separates him from more contemporary progressive mayors is that he has a mass movement behind him, specifically the DSA and the other like tenant union type, labor union type orgs that got him into office. And I don't know if you saw, but he created this mass democracy type office in City Hall. I was wondering what you think about the role of a mass movement in getting, pushing through some of these policies that he's trying to do. I think that is very necessary personally when it comes to any type of progressive governance, but especially on the municipal level, because you mentioned earlier of how challenging those institutional politics are, all of the different interest groups at play. I especially in New York City, I think he's going to need to lean on that.
I think that's very wise. That's not my lane, or I'm not an expert in that, but I think that's right. That's what got him there. It is making establishment Democrats try and figure out how to cope with this. They love the fact they say, oh my God, a lot of young people actually showed up and registered and voted or enthusiastic. I remember I was at a talk that the head of the board of NYC, the housing thing, gay, and he used to work for Cuomo. He's a decent guy, but not a Mamdani supporter. But he said, and it really stuck with me, he said, I go home and my kids are so excited about politics in ways that I have never seen them before. They're voting age kids. They're totally skeptical and cynical about government, and I've never been able to get them, and they just tell me, Dad, you know, it's just all this old junk. And he said, so that to me is really hopeful. I think you're also right about the necessity. New York's a funny, at the state it'll play out because the New York, both chambers in New York, Assembly and Senate, are now controlled by Democrats, which means New York City has a big influence on it. Governors it used to be Republicans controlled the Senate, and it was thought that New York governors liked that a lot because then they could play really New York City off against upstate Republicans, and then they could kind of land it. It's a very different dynamic now in Albany, in the state capital. And the governor now is kind of holding off much more progressive push from both chambers, and I think, so that could be a place where it plays itself out as in terms of state policy. The other is New York City Council, more progressive than Adams. Adams was seen by some people as a good check on the council. The council has a lot of progressives in it, and they will be for a lot of this stuff. He still has to work out those governing relationships, but they also saw, and they saw even more of those voters, you know. And some of them really do care about this stuff. So it's a great insight. I think it'll be an interesting lab for it to play out this way. I would say in some other cities, which I don't know as well, certainly Boston has some of that characteristics you're talking about. Michelle Wu's not a declared socialist. You know,
Right.
done that, but everyone's trying to figure out, and can you sustain that energy even when you can't, if you can't win everything that you said you were going to win?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I don't know.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great comment.
I wanted to ask, does Mamdani
Oh, sorry, let me get. Yeah, let's move it around, yeah. Hi.
In one of your, is this on? Okay.
Yeah, just
In one of
kiss
your
it.
slides, you talked about some of the myths about the housing market and what is making it more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to know those because, I mean, housing market's frustrating, but I don't want to be misdirecting the frustration. So.
Yeah, so here it is. And these are my beliefs that these are myths. Not everyone thinks these are myths. I want to say. So there is the second set of bullets there. So that it's private equity investments are driving the cost. Again, private equity investments in housing are a very small share. Actually, if you look at the bond documents from private equity firms, they say they want to invest in places that don't build much housing, right? Because if you're an investor and you're buying up housing, you don't want a lot of new supply because the value of your investment will be higher with a limited housing supply. And so they're very clear that a risk to their private equity bond payoffs would be if the city started to build a lot more housing. So I think the investors are mostly, mostly like 90% or more, small mom and pop investors in cities. That's who owns rentals. So that's one belief. Algorithms, again, I think are probably used by them. It's fine with me if people limit them. I don't think those are the fundamental drivers. There's a belief that landlords keep things off the market. I'm a progressive economist, I hope this came through, but I'm enough of an economist to think that for-profit entities don't generally want to get revenue and profit, you know, so also they can't afford it. So they really, and the theory of change behind that is that they do that and then eventually it drives rents up and then they put them back on. But the Phoenix area, especially if you look around here now, you can get 2-3 months rent off an apartment. Most of the complexes in Tempe here are offering 1 or 2 free months rent because there's a belief that there's supply. They're still very expensive, but that there's some supply.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So, you know, New York is a very unusual, by the standards of the country, it's pretty unique housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? So, you know, when you're talking about things like private equity investment, luxury development, algorithms, things like that, you know, my guess is that those things are, you know, I certainly agree with what you're saying about New York.
Mm-hmm.
I'm unaware of the relative situation elsewhere. So just in terms of the variation
Right.
across municipalities, how much would you think that is?
I can't give you every one of them, but I do know that of pretty broad study done by a very straight economist, so sometimes people question it. Said these problems used to be just in blue cities that regulated and red cities built a lot, and that was fine. Are now seeing that these rent squeezes, this is a Glazer-Goyorko paper, you're now seeing in Sunbelt areas the same kind of pressures coming, which are supply driven, which I'm happy to share. But it's to me it's dominantly supply. At the margin, could there be other stuff? Sure, but and if you look at Minneapolis or you look at Austin, Texas, or places that have built, San Diego versus Los Angeles, they're under the same state regime. San Diego's loosened up a lot of its zoning and approval and stuff. They're having much faster construction than LA is. Again, none of those are dispositive, but and again, it would be fine with me. Donald Trump says he wants to ban private equity from housing, right? He won't do it because just like he says he wants to do all sorts of, he wants to have 10% on your credit cards. You won't get that either, but it sounds good. So and I think it's smart when he's on it. Then that means there's some political antenna that he's picking up something where he feels he needs to talk about the housing stuff. Neighborhood character, displacement, gentrification has to get used a lot. I have to say I'm really there might be some displacement. You've got a better chance of slowing down displacement and gentrification if you build more supply where the rich people want to live in the first place. I stole this line from Teresa. Because the belief is otherwise then they want to live in that city, and if they can't get the place in the neighborhood they want to be in, then it kind of filters down, right? It kind of washes down and then pushes out and puts on downward pressure in that way. Local control and community voice sounds good on paper. The research generally, and this is really more about suburbs, is that it's dominated by white, wealthier homeowners, not by renters or people that you want to attach to. They're the ones who have time to show up at the meetings. They're the ones who vote for stuff, so that what sounded good for community voice is often often not representative of the community. And I'm a big believer in community voice, but I don't think the mechanisms we have now are adequate to get it. And then land scarcity, I would say it's filled up. That's what my favorite thing is. What controls the value of the land is zoning, right? What you can build on it, not how big the piece of land is. A favorite romance, someone says, well, there's no more land to build the housing. I stole this from a guy on the internet. He said, you know what, just put the houses on top of each other, meaning an apartment building, right? So, Craig, do you have some?
Yeah.
Did that help get at the stuff? And I'd be happy to send you some stuff.
So thanks, Rick. This is really good. I want to see if it's okay to pull you beyond housing
Sure.
For a moment.
Try.
And ask about investment, jobs, and taxes,
Yes.
which are not unrelated because Mamdani has a program to pay for some of the things he wants to do, some related to housing, most not, by raising taxes.
Yep.
There's a standoff with the governor about the tax issue.
Yep.
And there are similar assertions to the ones being made about building new housing, the ones that made you say, I'm an economist, even if I'm progressive. There's a market. Money's not going to flow into building new housing if it's not incentives. Around capital investment generally, and therefore around jobs. So my question after that long-winded introduction is,
right.
Does this hold water? How likely do you think it is that the Democratic Socialist mayor will face a capital strike of any significance and or an out-migration of billionaires? And this, of course, has analogs to the California campaign around a billionaire's tax and other sorts of agendas as well. Do you think that billionaires and or corporate investors enact a short-term interest in trying to escape these taxes, or find a way to price those in and more or less continue responding to the things that made them want to be in New York or California anyway?
Well, the cheap answer, just like to the first housing question, is both, right? Some will do that, and partly as a demonstration of their class loyalty, which they have, and some won't. So when I think about location and why do people invest in places, I don't think taxes, either for individuals or for the subsidies that cities and states give away from their tax base, are the dominant reason why capital flows in or flows out. I do think for cities, there's some basic stuff, public safety, schools, some housing affordability, just quality of life things that matter for household decisions, particularly when they have suburban choices in that metro. But that metro is still dominated by a set of core industries. And I don't think the rich people will move on tax sensitivity. I haven't, my reading of that is that it's not a dominant piece of the story. So I would kind of flip it back and say, okay, what are New York's core industries where you can have jobs and better jobs, and how do you encourage those, as well as being a place for innovation and new creation. One of New York's great advantages over places like Philadelphia or other cities in the history of the U.S. is this constant reinvention and churning of itself into new sectors. It used to be a manufacturing hub, although never heavy manufacturing like clothing and consumer goods and mostly. It started as a port. It's one of the great ports of the world. But it started as shipping and all that. You get finance and other things. But it's always been open to new stuff. There's a lot of tech in New York now. Again, how many jobs tech is going to ultimately give us is another issue. Services, human services. Danny Roderick has a new book out on prosperity where he says this obsession with manufacturing is like, that's pretty done, even for developing countries, and certainly I think for Americans. Just, it's so capital intensive and sophisticated now, you're not going to get a big scale out of jobs out of manufacturing stuff. These chip plants are not, leaving their subsidy things aside, they might be necessary for industrial policy, but you're not going to get a lot of employment out of that. Employment's now going to come in services. So how do we make the services more productive and pay them better? That, to me, is the, which would then help make the city a better place to live and everything that. So I'm not so worried about a capital strike issue in terms of investment flows. Individuals, yeah, I mean, Peter Thiel will probably move from California, but he wanted to live on an oil platform once and declared a sovereign nation, you know, so that's, and the head of NVIDIA in California, probably the richest guy going, says, well, yeah, I'll pay, he said that he'd pay the billionaire's tax. So it's a great question, though, and I think, and it is something I didn't do it in this one, so I'm really glad you brought it up, because I've been working on another of my messages to my progressive colleagues is that it's not just redistribution. Daniel Wortel London's book, Menace of Prosperity, which I had a lot of disagreements with, was on to something, right? That if this is your model, this kind of regulated capitalism and in cities based on land value, you've got real constraints and challenges with it. And we don't think enough, and I include myself in this, like, where do the jobs and the stuff come from? How do we keep growth going? So I'm not at all a degrowther, and there may be people who are. And I don't have a good answer to that, but it's something I'm struggling with. So thanks for the question. It really teed that up for me. And I haven't, Mamdani's been silent on that. He doesn't talk. He's making good relationships with the firms in New York who are finance primarily that he has to worry about. And then he's got a thing about small businesses. I'm fine for small businesses, but again, they don't scale in my view. My dream world is regulated oligopolies that you could, where labor could organize them and share the rents. And how that works out in the macro, I don't know. But
just to summarize on the location question, a necessary trade-off, interrelationship between costs like taxes,
yeah,
or higher housing or whatever, regulated employment, and locational advantages. And so, to cite another Harvard economist, you had Danny Roderick, it's an Ed Glazer kind of argument.
Oh yeah, Glazer's the guy I referred to before on the
pricing. If there's a strong set of locational advantages,
yep,
they can continue to outweigh those various costs. And so
sure,
that's what progressives need to look at in asking how much can they impose in the way of costs through taxes or regulation or whatever.
Yeah, as well as locational advantages. When I worked for Governor Cuomo on a financial services thing, everyone said, how are we going to keep these how are we going to keep the back office jobs from moving to Dallas? And I had to tell them, you're not. You know, what you need is continued innovation on the other stuff, because unless you really want to make New York like Dallas, it's routine stuff. You know. On the other hand, there's something about cities that, and this is kind of intangible, that it borrows from Glazer, or it's sympathetic with Glazer, that innovation and dynamism are the thing that you really want, and you never know quite where it's going to come from when you mix all that stuff together. And those, to me, are those conditions and amenities that you want around that to keep the city as a place where you do get innovation and you do get different ideas, and that they can find a way to make some money at that. My friend Mitchell Moss at NYU loves to say, you know, every time there's a new technology, everyone says, well, that's the death of cities. You know, oh, the telegraph came in, oh, the radio, oh, telephones, oh, television. Now the guys can all, the capitalists can all sit somewhere else and, you know, phone in on video phones and nothing will work. And every time what's happened is that the stuff is concentrated more in cities. We have more concentrated cities than we had before. I'm not sure I get that. You always worry about this time it's different. Maybe Zoom and the pandemic will really diversify that, but we haven't seen it. And globally, of course, as you know, cities are, people are moving, we're a metropolitan world, and that's only increasing. And some of that's for a bunch of not great reasons. But I think some of it is that's the way the economy goes. So all which is to say you still have to be mindful. You can't just confiscate people's incomes and expect that that will work out for you. We have a lot of failed cities. I'm doing too much of my book now. I'll stop now. But that cities also can collapse and meet challenges that they can't go in the future. Detroit being the key one on my brain. But it's a great question, and I think for progressives, it's really worth thinking about, not just distribution, but production.
I wanted to ask about what does Mamdani's election do to the ideology of socialism, the idea of socialism, and has he been able, or that whole process, generated some interest in the young generation who are excited about politics, what socialism might stand for?
Oh, this is not my lane.
I know.
Do you want to talk to that? I know we have some people, some DSA people in the room here. I'd love to hear from them and younger people about it. Yeah, I don't. Yeah.
We're almost at 100K members in the DSA nationally. So
Okay. Yeah. 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 So, what do you think? Is that energizing? And does it change the ideology? Does this look like the quote ideology or the program?
Yeah, I mean, I do think one thing that's funny, I'm Emily, I'm the co-chair for the DSA chapter here in Phoenix. One thing that's funny is that what we call democratic socialism in the United States is really very much a big tent, and it includes a lot of people who in Europe I think would be social democrats, right? A lot of Mamdani's agenda is more of a social democrat, and
Yes.
then the same was true of Bernie.
Mm-hmm.
But because, you know, the ideology in the United States is so shifted, you end up with this socialism label, and I feel like we're like, all right, you know, let's run with it.
Yeah.
And I think there are also people who have a more radical view, who are sort of more traditionally, truly socialist,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of a big tent for now, and you see how far you can go.
Yeah. There's a Mamdani tweet that got thrown at him from a few years ago where he talked about seizing the means of production, but he hasn't said that recently. So, yeah,
There's
yeah.
a lot of traditional social democratic elements in there. I think there are some more real socialistic elements. Some of these are definitely like post-capitalist ideas, like public grocery stores. I would say if he does manage to do social housing, that would be
Mhm.
strikingly different approach to housing than what we've been used to in the U.S. But I think Big Ten's good. We got everybody from people on the like really far to the left to social democrats and DSA.
Yeah.
And I think it's also changed the landscape of where we're going to be organizing. I think it's reinvigorated municipal politics. I mean, prior to 2025, I was like, the cities aren't going to change here. I did not pay attention to municipal politics at all.
Yeah.
I was like, that's a lost cause.
Yeah, yeah.
So he reinvigorated my hope in
Oh, that's great.
municipalism
Yeah.
and sewer socialism.
That's great. Yeah, no, I really like this point. By the way, social movements are big. I'm always reminded when we talk about this about, I don't know if you know the great Parting the Waters, Taylor Branch's History of the Civil Rights Movement. Fantastic books if you've never read them. And he starts not with Martin Luther King. No, we're starting now. The first person you read about is a black preacher in Mississippi in a town where he can't even go out after sundown because he'll get killed for trying to register people to vote. And sorry, it's always very moving to me to remember that's that movement. And it's scaled, and it ended up with everyone from people who thought King was too radical to the Black Panthers to everything in between, a lot of white sympathizers. social movements are big, and I think that was Emily's point too. And so you don't want to be, you want to see how they take form. And to get a majoritarian position, it's going to be big and kind of messy and all that. So, so that's great. I'll be interested in keep an eye on those aspects. Yeah.
Join my DSA comments of this. So I think there's an answer around, if you will, ideology. It's the question is there's an answer around concrete policies, which is I think a lot of what
That's good.
One of the changes for socialists in the U.S. though, and for DSA and its 50-year history, maybe harkening back to Debs or something, is the DSA matters as an organization now. One of the things that happens.
That's good.
It's not just ideology, it's not just policy, it's a gatekeeping organization for endorsements. So watch something like the fight over Velasquez's seat
Yes.
in New York.
Yeah.
And this is not just socialism in general, or even DSA in general, it's the New York and especially Brooklyn base for DSA. So
Yeah.
there's organizational politics of things like who's going to get an endorsement, which may
Yeah.
be completely congruent or may be in tension with the more ideological and policy discussions.
Yes, absolutely. And so there's a seat where a Latino representative is withdrawing, and Antonio, one of the Brooklyn Borough president, who has a lot of union support, is running for it. But Mamdani and DSA are pushing an alternative candidate who's trying very hard to work with labor. And it's very micro. The Seattle mayor, Katie Wilson, identifies, I guess, as a socialist, but she's not DSA endorsed because apparently they said she didn't want to talk about that, maybe on a judgment that I can't get elected if I say that. But that's exactly to your point. It is now becoming, and that in turn will have, I'm sure, for the members of DSA, internal complications in the organization. But yeah, it's a very lively time we're in.
We are out of time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So
Rick.
we can talk afterwards.
Oh, because I do just want to say,
Yeah, give me
since
one.
I was in Seattle before and I canvassed for Katie Wilson, like the reason, after the primary, the reason why the Seattle DSA didn't endorse Katie Wilson was because there was a vote on this, but it was like the majority, I mean, I wasn't there for the vote, but like the majority of the members didn't vote to endorse Katie Wilson.
Yeah, sure.
But there were still many DSA
No, it's a
members.
democratic organization, and yeah, but she will still work for her, yeah. Anyway, this was great. I learned a lot. I hope it was good for you all. Any more follow-ups and stuff? I think the center can make the slide deck available. Keep an eye on the center's other things. Thanks once again to Michael, the center, but also particularly to Maria Esch, and is Kayla still here? Yeah, Kayla's still here. I want to really thank you. And thank you all.
Thanks very much, Rick. And just so everybody knows, Rick and Teresa Ghilarducci, who's sitting right here, are actually going to be with us all year, I believe. So you'll have lots of opportunity to speak with both of them. These are very unusual experts around Tempe, so it's really an exceptional moment that we get to have both of them here. So take advantage of it while they're in town. Once again, thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. And pay attention to our events board. We have a bunch of stuff happening this spring, so we hope to see you there. Take care.